If you are integrating any components around ERP, you are going to have so many different options. So we are going to look at the top 10 integration technologies that you might come across during your ERP implementation. So let's dive in. Hello everyone, my name is Sam Gupta. I am principal at Elevate IQ. Elevate IQ is the independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm. We help our clients with the ERP selection, digital transformation strategy, enterprise architecture, system integration, as well as ERP implementation. So let's get back to today's topic, which is going to be top 10 ERP integration technologies in 2023. So number 10 on our list is natively built within ERP code, custom built and externally deployed. So in this particular case, this is going to be the technologies where you have, let's say if you are buying an ERP, for example, NetSuite, Acumatica, for Epicor, and you are keeping your integration code inside the ERP. When companies are integrating this for the first time, they might not understand the pros and cons of these approaches. They are only going to look at more from the finance perspective that, okay, whatever is going to be cheaper. So for the most part, when you are going to host these things inside the underlying code of NetSuite, Acumatica, then it's going to be cheaper just because you are not buying an external iPass, but that does not mean that it's not going to have any sort of cons. So depending upon the functionality and depending upon what you are trying to do, it might be good for certain things. So what is it good for? So for tightly integrated processes that touch master data, such as inventory, okay, for these things, this particular integration type or this particular code base might be fit. A code base that is not likely to change as much. That could be a great fit for this particular technology. The code base that the OEM must own. If OEM is actually owning the code base, then that is the right use case for this particular technology. Now, there are some, and there is going to be confusion, misunderstanding around that. So that is going to be host all the integration code inside the ERP to save. And typically, the companies that are going to be implementing this for the first time, they might not have as much IT sophistication. They are going to do that. But because of that, you might have a lot of different issues. For example, if integration code is going to break, you might feel that it's NetSuite or Microsoft that is breaking, but that is not the case. It might be your integration code that you may put in there that might be breaking. Typically for the integration code, it's better that you keep it outside that can be managed easily so that you are not relying on ERP consultants all the time. Now, the other myth that you are going to have is the ERP integration logic can carry the additional workload. Most people struggle to understand that this is going to be the transactional workload that you are putting on the ERP system. So when you look at any of these systems, they assume the capacity that you are only going to be using this for the code base that they are providing as part of the package, and you are not going to be doing any sort of major customization or the integration on top of that. They might not have considered that as part of the infrastructure that they might be offering you as part of your SaaS subscription. So the myth is going to be that ERP integration logic can carry the additional workload, but you might face performance issues just because your assumption was that it can carry the workload, but the system was not designed to carry that workload, so you might have issues there. So what are the best practices around this particular technology? Host integration code inside the ERP that is tightly coupled with master data. Host any native add-ons inside the ERP. Don't host the integration code inside the ERP that requires frequent changes or prone to errors. And this is going to be something like EDI centric code when you are going to be integration, communication, transformation with the external interfaces. Typically, they are going to break because of the changes in the inputs. Sometimes that cannot be modeled as part of the integration code. So that is not the right candidate for this particular integration technology. So that's number 10. Now, number 9 on our list is workflow automation or RPA. Workflow automation and RPA are great technologies for doing any sort of ad hoc workflows that need to sit on top of your ERP. For the most part, workflow automation and RPA are designed for desktop centric integration. They are not even designed for integration that are going to be transactionally tied, that should be done with the other technologies. For this particular technology, the right use cases are going to be, for example, let's say if you are validating any sort of master data, okay, the validation logic where you have a lot of different user inputs, that could be a great candidate just because you are simply certifying or qualifying the data, but you should not be hosting any sort of business rules inside your workflow automation unless they are improving the quality of data going in to your ERP. So what is it good for? It is good for user and desktop centric workflows and processes, good for tightening the processes around transactional systems such as your ERP or e-commerce, good for ad hoc processes. The myth is going to be replacement for other transactional technologies. Workflow automation and RPA are more cutting edge, and this is the common misunderstanding that is there in the industry, that these are cutting edge technologies and legacy technologies should be replaced, but they both have their roles and they have their own strengths in terms of what they are good for. So don't overuse workflow automation or RPA technologies. The other myth that we have in the market is they are easier than other technologies such as ERP. That's not true. ERP is designed for a purpose. RPA is designed for a purpose. Workflow technologies are designed for a purpose. So use for the right job. The best practices: define architecture and roles of the RPA and workflow technologies in the architecture. Analyze the admin efforts first to ensure that it's not a symptom of broken processes. And sometimes you are going to have broken processes. You are going to feel that ERP is harder to use. And because of that, I'm going to implement my RPA workflow technology. And hopefully that is going to solve all of my problems. Typically, that does not solve anything. It's only going to overload your processes. It's only going to slow you down. So if you have process or data issues, fix that first before implementing any sort of technology. Don't implement RPA and workflow tech just because they are cutting edge. Any technology you should not be implementing just because that is cutting edge. You must have business problem, and then you need to find the right technology that can solve that problem. So that's number 9. Now, number 8 on our list is e-commerce and marketplaces. Now, some people might not feel that e-commerce and marketplaces are the integration technologies, but they help with the specific integration when you are going to be interacting with specific customer personas. For example, when you are going to be interacting with your sales channels, most e-commerce companies are going to feel that all of those channels should come through your e-commerce platform. Now, depending upon the architecture, depending upon what you are trying to do, depending upon where your master data resides, the decision could vary. So that's why you need to sort of evaluate whether marketplaces should go through e-commerce ERP depending upon the business goals. So what is it good for? Smaller e-commerce brands that cannot afford expensive integration just yet. So there are 3 options when you look at integrating with sales channels. So you are going to have EDI, you are going to have punchout, and then you can offer this as more of the B2B commerce experience. Now, bigger brands typically are going to be integrating through EDI just because they may have that infrastructure set up, or they might be on P2P, so you need to integrate with their punchouts. But there might be some vendors who might not afford the EDI, so it's easier for these brands to be able to publish the e-commerce platform where they can easily log in so that you don't have to communicate with them manually. Now, integrating with marketplaces that are extensions of that channel. So if you are accounting for that channel as the extension, when you are accounting for the inventory, maybe you don't care for the traceability of the channel, you are treating them as the consolidated sort of channel. If that is the case, then that could be a great case to integrate through this. Now, the third factor that we have is marketplaces and channels where segmentation of inventory for each channel is not as critical. If that is the case, then this could be a great candidate for that integration as well. Myth: most channels must be routed through e-commerce, including punchouts. And that's the common misunderstanding we have in the market, especially the e-commerce vendors. They all are going to be claiming that everything should come through e-commerce, especially if that is going to be a sales channel. Now, depending upon the architecture, depending upon how your master data is set up, depending upon what traceability you are looking for, depending upon your pricing and discount, the architecture could vary. The other myth that we have is pricing must belong to e-commerce. Now, that could be a debate with depending upon how your organization is set up. Most of the e-commerce vendors are going to feel that the pricing should be controlled by e-commerce. Sales and marketing teams are going to feel that the pricing must be controlled by e-commerce. But if you are looking for centralizing the pricing and discounting and you need traceability inside your ERP system, the decision could vary depending upon what you are trying to accomplish. Now, the other myth that we have around this particular technology is bi-directional syncs are easy to implement through APIs. That is not true at all. Now, if you are going to be implementing bi-directional syncs where data is getting manipulated at both places, you are going to have substantial issues unless you control the workflow. Bi-directional things, especially if you are going to have very complex object here where you have, let's say, the sales order is getting manipulated here with different persona, and then you have sales order here in the downstream system and it has many different stages. A lot of people are updating that as well. And when you are going to be syncing the states across the system boundaries, you are most likely going to have issues. So the easiest way to implement this is going to be control the workflow, define the roles and responsibilities, define how these changes are going to flow to both of the system and how you are going to be mapping that bi-directional workflow. The design is critical. Unless you have the design down, you might have issues with the bi-directional syncs. So what are the best practices? Define the role of e-commerce marketplace and channels, define the traceability required for pricing and discounting, and host in appropriate channels. Treat e-commerce as an order capture channel and then move to the central system. Depending upon, again, in this particular case as well, this is probably the simplest architecture that you can build. But if your e-commerce layer is going to be thick, then you might need to invest a little bit more time in thinking through all of those scenarios if e-commerce is going to be doing a lot more. But the simplest architecture always is going to be that treat e-commerce as order capture and centralized that transaction in the downstream system. It's just easier that way. So that's number 8. Number 7 on our list is API. So what are APIs good for? So this is going to be really when you are trying to integrate your internal system where you can exchange the security workflow. And there is a lot of misunderstanding in the community where they are going to claim that, you know what, APIs are the modern ways of communicating. Let's say if you are using EDI to communicate, that's not a good thing. But EDI has a place, API has a place. So this is good for easily communicating with internal systems. With APIs, you are not necessarily tempering the core logic of the system. So tomorrow, let's say if you need to compare your ERP implementation with the out-of-the-box data or the implementation, you can easily do that. If you are going to host your integration code inside your ERP, it might be much harder to compare. So that's why you need to isolate to be able to debug and to be able to understand the issues. To isolate core systems from the integration logic, that's what it is really good for. The myth, APIs are replacement for architecture, which is not true at all. You still need to design. You have APIs, which is a great communication method, but that does not mean that APIs are going to design by themselves. Even though you have API, you still have to figure out your workflows. You need to figure out your transactional boundaries. You need to figure out what data you are going to be exchanging and how that data is going to be reconciled. So now the other myth we have is as long as you have the APIs, you can integrate anything. That's not true at all. APIs have a place, but again, APIs are not going to integrate anything by themselves. You still have to create the integration workflows and logic. The only thing APIs are able to do is they are able to hide the technical boilerplate, but for the most part, the integration is very similar in general. The best practices: define security architecture before incorporating integration through APIs. We have seen scenarios where you are going to open the whole application through your API, and sometimes you don't even know that. Just because the developers or IT, they are simply going to open up this hole inside your API layer. And even though your ERP might be controlled through your SOX compliance, but you have this big giant security hole through your application just because you have opened up access for these vendor or partner, and they are able to even delete the table or databases. So it could be that bad. So make sure you define the security architecture before incorporating any sort of integration through APIs. Isolate integration code completely from the core system. Now define system integration flows and master data governance path even with APIs. That is not optional. You still have to define that. You still have to define master data governance flows. So now that's number 7. Number 6 integration type that we have is P2P and punchouts. And this is going to be very common with companies that have a P2P system already or a punchout system that are offering to integrate. The reason why they do that is because they are trying to streamline their vendor workflows so that they are not investing as much manual effort in coordinating, in understanding where you are with their PO, in tracking the dates. So that's why they have the punchouts. They are trying to reduce the manual effort. Now, some people might argue that P2P integration are better than the other integrations. Again, that's not true. Okay, sometimes this is mandated by the customers. This has a specific use case. If your customers are mandating P2P, sometimes P2P might go through e-commerce, sometimes ERP, depending upon the architecture, depending upon what you're trying to do. So what is it good for? So integrating with customers that are too big to go to vendor's website to place orders, and you cannot enforce. For example, let's say if you are going to ask your larger customers to go to your site, that might not be possible. They might not have time. So they are going to mandate that, you know what, if you want to do business with me, you have to come through P2P. Now, it is also good for integrating with suppliers when you aim to consolidate and centrally govern your procurement processes. So let's say if you are trying to consolidate your processes, then you might utilize a P2P to interact with your vendors. So that's what it is good for. The myth that we have around P2P is punchout and P2P systems are superior to ERP. That's not true at all. P2P have their own use case in terms of what they are good for. It has leaner data model. That's why they might be perceived as slightly easier to use, but that does not mean that they are superior to ERP by any means. The other myth that we have is P2P systems are best for any procurement organizations. That's not true at all. P2P systems are going to be good for larger organizations. They might be good for smaller organizations as well. Again, if they are trying to consolidate their procurement organization, they are trying to implement that guided selling experience, they are trying to integrate with the vendors. So again, depending upon the organizational need, P2P systems could be great. They might not be as great. The other myth that we have is punchout must go through the e-commerce channel. That is not true at all. Sometimes they might go through e-commerce. Sometimes they might go through ERP, depending upon the use case, depending upon the architecture. The best practices around this is integrate with P2P if your large customers have mandated them. Define the roles and responsibilities of P2P versus ERP versus e-commerce. Each of these systems have a role to play in the architecture. So you need to define, and they are going to have substantial overlap. So you need to define the roles and responsibilities of each of these systems. Now define the reconciliation and master data governance workflow for P2P, ERP, and e-commerce systems. If you don't define the master data governance, if you don't define the reconciliation workflows, and if you're simply going to implement these systems, you might have issues. So that's number 6. Number 5 on our list is ISV add-ons. And there are going to be some ISV add-ons that are going to play the role of integration, and that could be replacement for that. Now, they might be good in certain use cases. So they are going to be good in the case where you are integrating with vendors that might not be able to afford other expensive integrations, and they might be able to provide pre-baked integrations. Sometimes they could be a great fit for that integration workflow. Now, they might provide additional granularity with the business objects and workflows, and sometimes this granularity may not be available in your e-commerce, that might not be available in your ERP, so you are getting added value as part of this integration. So in those use cases, they could be a great fit. Now, hosting additional data that might not be relevant for the ERP, in that case, they could be a great fit as well. Now, the myth that we are going to have is enterprise architecture is not relevant with the ISV add-ons. That's not true at all. Just because they can be integrated with NetSuite, they are simply the add-on. If they have a different database, you have to define reconciliation workflows. You need to define master data governance workflows. You need to define enterprise architecture, or you are going to have issues. The other myth that we have is master data governance and reconciliation workflows are not relevant for ISV add-ons. The ISV add-ons are easier than ERP. Again, that's not true at all. They have a role to play in the architecture. They solve a very specific problem, and they typically have the leaner data model. And that is the reason why they could be perceived as easier than ERP, but that's not true. Now, the best practices is enterprise architecture is relevant with ISV add-ons. So make sure you pay attention to that. Make sure you spend time with master data governance as well as reconciliation workflows, and make sure that you are using ISV add-ons just because they are going to add value to your architecture. So that's number 5. Now, number 4 on our list is going to be webhooks. Now, webhooks can be perceived as easier to integrate. Most of the SaaS platforms, they all are going to claim that this is probably the modern technology that they have introduced and they can support this. And typically, webhooks integration is good when you are doing the web-to-web integration. So what is it good for? It is going to be for easier web-centric integrations that don't require tight master data governance. So if you are simply sending a link or simply sending a message that does not have as much implication on your master data, then this particular integration could be a great fit. But when you are looking for slightly more financial integration or transactional integration, where your data guarantee is probably going to be a key for you, for those use cases, this integration might be as good. Easier to use with web-centric technologies. If you have web-centric technologies, this is great, but any of the serious integration that you are going to be doing, for example, let's say where dollars are going to be involved, the webhooks integration might not be as great. Good for integration flows where tight security may not be a concern. The myth: webhooks are easier than other integration technologies such as EDI. Again, they have a role to play, and typically when the integration is not going to be as serious, that's when you are probably going to be using webhooks. But for the most part, when you are dealing with financials, dollars, as well as when you are doing external integration, when the guaranteed delivery is going to be a key, then webhooks may not be the best candidate. Webhooks are modern ways of integration. Again, that's a myth. That's not true at all. They have a role to play. The technologies that don't support webhooks integration are legacy. Again, that's not true at all. Okay, webhooks is great. They serve a purpose, but they are not replacement for everything. The best practices: use webhooks integration for commerce and web-centric technologies. Analyze the impact on omni-channel architecture if webhooks are still a good fit. Understand the security needs, master data governance before integrating it with webhooks. So that's number 4. Number 3 on our list is ETL. And ETL is a very interesting technology. It is really designed for that database to database transfer. For the most part, it is really good for that bulk data transfer. Typically, you are going to have 3 different layers. You have the web layer, you have the services layer, you have the database layer, and each of these layers could have their own integration. ETL is typically good for that database layer, but then even ETL is going to be overutilized, overconsumed in the architecture. And we have seen scenarios where you are sort of calling the web services as part of your ETL workflow. Typically, ETL is not a great fit for that. So what is ETL good for? That's going to be for bulk data transfer among databases. Nightly load to get data in a snapshot to perform analysis. That is the right use case for ETL. Where faster processing at the database level is required, that's when ETL could be a great fit. The myth that we are going to have ETL can cater to most integration scenarios. That is not true. If you are going to be doing the integration of the service layer and you are going to move that to your ETL layer, you might have implications there. Don't use ETL where service layer integration may be a better fit. And that is going to be, so when you are communicating at the database layer, you are sort of bypassing all of the business rules. Typically, the role of service layer is going to be you are keeping the business rules in your service layer and you are bypassing some of the rules at least. So when you are communicating with database directly, you are bypassing all of that. But when you are getting this data only for the analysis, then at that time, the rules are not really important. You are simply trying to grab the data. And that's why ETL is a great fit for that. But when you have the service layer integration, where the business rules are going to be critical, where security, the SOX compliance is going to be critical, you need to go through service layer. Don't use ETL for EDI or external integration with other businesses. Again, that's not a right use case for the ETL. So that's number 3. Now, number 2 on our list is EDI, and EDI is designed for external B2B communication where you are not going to be exchanging the security information. When you exchange the security information, for example, if you are going to be communicating with APIs, you require the security credentials. Now, if you are dealing with the other businesses, you don't want to exchange the security token. You might be exchanging the security token only when you are setting up the network. At that time, you might have the trusted trading partner that you need to set up. But once you are set up, then you don't need to exchange the security information. So that's why EDI is really designed for that external B2B communication where you have the messages that all of these businesses understand and they are trying to exchange so that there is no sort of miscommunication there. With APIs, every company has their own sort of APIs, so they might not be as formalized as the EDI layer. So again, EDI has a role to play in the architecture. Understand the role of EDI, where that is going to be used. It's not meant to be replacement of API. Both of them have a place. So what is it good for? For B2B communication, where sharing credentials is not an option, where standardized messages are a requirement across all vendors, integrating with vendors that might already understand EDI or may have systems that are EDI compliant. For them, EDI could be a great fit. The myth around EDI is going to be EDI is a legacy communication method. EDI should never be used. APIs are a better choice for integration. EDI is slow and error prone. That is not true at all. The best practices for EDI is going to be use EDI where the systems might already be EDI compliant. Implement EDI where standardized communication could reduce churn with vendor communication. Don't use EDI for internal communication. So that's number 2. Now, number 1 on our list is iPass or middleware. So iPass or middleware are going to be used when you are doing the system-to-system communication. The most comparable for this is going to be your workflow technologies or the RPA. Sometimes they are confused in terms of where to use your iPass middleware versus where to use your workflow technologies. iPass is going to be when you are doing system-to-system communication, meaning you are trying to integrate your ERP to e-commerce, ERP to WMS, ERP to TMS, when you don't have as much user interaction as you would when you are designing your user-centric workflows. So that's the real difference between iPass middleware as well as your workflow technologies. So what is it going to be good for? It is to implement integration logic. When you have the system integration logic, that's what iPass is really good for. To have room for load throttling. So especially in the cloud world, you don't have as much control from the database perspective of these systems. So you lose that IT control that you had in the traditional environment where you could spin off many different servers and you could throttle the load. So here, what iPass can do is it can provide you all of those capabilities where you can slow down the processing of messaging in terms of how many messages are going to be sent to your downstream system. So you can accommodate all of those workflows when you are going to have, let's say, one system is slower, one system is faster. So when you need those IT-centric controls, that's where your iPass is going to be really handy. Now, the other benefit that you have with this is to isolate your integration logic. And typically your integration logic is going to be error prone. So make sure you don't keep the integration code inside your ERP and you are keeping it separate so that you can isolate, you can compare, it's going to be easier to debug. The myth that we have around the iPass and middleware integration technology is unnecessary license fee. IT-centric systems are only relevant for large enterprises. That's not true at all. The architecture matters for everyone, regardless of the size of the company, regardless of whether you are using cloud or any other systems. So architecture is still important. iPass is going to be relevant for you regardless of your size. Now, best practices for iPass is going to be don't host business rules and logic that must be hosted in the core system. If the logic belongs to your core system, that touches your master data, that needs to be part of your security workflow, then that has to reside inside your ERP system. So here you are only keeping the integration transformation logic simply to transform the messages that you are going to send to your ERP, but don't try to hijack and keep the business logic inside your integration layer. Host only the workflows that are geared towards system-to-system communication. So that's another best practice. So that's number 1. So that's it for this list. If you enjoyed this list, we are going to include a detailed article within the description. So you might want to check that out. If you prefer audio form, this podcast is also available on Spotify, Google, and Apple as WBS Rocks. So you might want to check that as well as hit subscribe. We publish these videos on a weekly basis. So hit the subscribe button on YouTube. If you have not checked our digital transformation report for 2023, we are going to include the link of that as well. On that note, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one.